Okay, everybody, 3.2 visual texts, full grade breakdown. I'm going to run through not achieved all the way through to excellence, looking at the NCEA assessment report and give you a few extra tips along the way. So let's get straight into things. Right, so format of this video is I'm going to run you from not achieved through to excellence using the NZQA assessment report as the basis for my discussion. Now, if you want a reminder of what the assessment report is, it is a document produced by the marking panel for a set exam, in this case the 3.2 visual text examination, which essentially discusses what that marking panel consistently saw at each grade boundary. It can sometimes be a more useful document than looking at achievement standards or even assessment criteria because it gets into some of the finer details and sometimes raises talking points we might not see in those documents. If you want more information on this, I have a whole separate video on the assessment report. You can check that out on my channel too. Just a quick disclaimer here is that the assessment report for the 3.2 visual text exam doesn't quite go into the level of detail that some of the other assessment reports in the English subject area do, like for example the 3.1 assessment report I used for my previous video. This will mean in this video that I probably don't get into the same level of detail, and alternatively that I probably bring in some more of my own input as a head of English and as an English teacher to kind of fill in some of the gaps or extend on some of the talking points here. So just bear that in mind. Quick disclaimer for you. Not achieved. Right. What does a not achieved do? Well, first talking point is about the statement. Shock, horror. It's about the statement. Basically, it's either the fact that you ignore or you misunderstand the statement. Now, I talk about this at length in virtually every video that I ever do. I'm constantly telling you that the statement is critical. It's fundamental to your success in the exam is A, that you select the right statement, which is one that you understand. And secondly, that when you select a statement, you don't ignore it, that you constantly refer back to it and you use it as the basis of your discussion. So it's no surprises then that the top bullet point in the not achieved category is ignoring or misunderstanding the statement. Misunderstanding the statement basically means that you've probably not fully grasped what it's asking you to discuss, or some of the key words in the statement don't make complete sense to you, and maybe you've panic picked and you've tried to kind of run with it, but it's clear to the marker that you don't fully understand what you're meant to be discussing. So this is just another lesson in taking your time at the beginning of the exam, making sure that you choose a statement that works for you, that you understand, and that is time well spent that will lead you down the right track rather than falling into the trap of a poorly chosen statement. Okay, so the second thing that I want to talk about is again in reference to the statement, and I've highlighted it because I think it's particularly important, but that is only discussing certain aspects of the statement. Now, if you want a reminder of what the aspects in English are, yeah, you're in luck. I have a whole video on that on my channel as well, but I'll run through them for you. They are ideas, purposes and audiences, structure, and language features. Now, when you see a statement, it is likely that two of those aspects, two is a ballpark figure, sometimes there can be more than that, but largely it's two. Two of those aspects will be featured in the statement somewhere. So you might get a statement, for example, saying that like narrative structure is fundamental to the director achieving their vision. Now, what you have there is you've got narrative structure. So you've got the aspect of structure as a talking point or keyword for you. And you've got this concept of the director's vision, which probably relates to purposes and audiences. So you can kind of see you've got two aspects in that statement. So what they're saying here for a not achieved is that sometimes students don't fully grasp that there are multiple aspects that they need to be discussing in their written response. And that means that maybe you only address one of them or kind of partially touch on the second one, but not in enough detail to actually get you across the line and achieved. So what I'm essentially trying to get at here in a very long-winded way is that when you select your statement, you probably want to think about the aspects that are kind of in that statement and make sure that you're discussing them both in a balanced way. Okay, so the third one down is essentially just a lack of evidence. So it's insufficient or having no relevant details from the study text. What that means is you don't have examples, and it means that you don't have specific evidence, which in a visual text exam can take the form of quotes in the form of dialogue, or alternatively, other kind of film techniques or language features, stuff like camera angles, discussion of stuff like symbolism, editing techniques, whatever. There's a whole range of things that you could be discussing. If you have none of that, then obviously you have insufficient or no relevant detail. You're not going to get across the line. Fourth one down is just having chosen a bad text. Now, this is unlikely to happen if you do the text that your teacher has recommended you do in class and has spent like probably a whole term teaching you. It's basically for students that might go rogue, decide that they want to choose their own text because, like, hey, I don't really like, the Shawshank Redemption or the Barbie movie or whatever your teachers taught you. And, like, I don't know, I want to do, the Hunger Games because that's what I like. Except that that text might not have the level of sophistication and complexity required of a level 3 NCEA student. So picking a text that's too simple can be a disadvantage, can lead you to a not achieved. We'll touch on text selection a little bit later as well. And last but not least, it's just not writing enough. What does this mean in NCEA level 3? To me, it's probably anything less than 700 words. You're in the kind of problematic zone. There are certain standards in level 3 that specify, for example, that 650 words is about the minimum that they would expect a student to produce. Here I'm thinking of the 3.4 writing portfolio internal standard, where it actually specifies that 650 words is kind of what is expected of a student. So therefore, I'd say if you're writing significantly less than that, then yeah, you're going to struggle. You're probably not going to develop your ideas in enough complexity to get across the line. So all of those things add up to a not achieved. Achieved. What did you do? Well, to achieve, you wrote a straightforward explanatory response. In other words, you wrote an essay, probably had an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. It's straightforward, meaning that it responds to the statement and it doesn't really deviate too far from it. It moves in a straightforward line towards the concluding remarks at the end of the essay. And along the way, it's explaining itself, or rather, you are explaining yourself, meaning that when you make a point in a body paragraph, you explain what you're trying to say there, and you're probably using some evidence to back yourself up, which we'll get to very shortly. And also, you are showing some insight. This is the second talking point. What does some insight mean? It essentially means that you understand the text and you've got some half decent kind of interpretation or analysis of it. You have some ideas about it. You have some things that you want to say about it. And these things are not super simplistic. They are perhaps meaningful. Yes, there may be some simple points in an achieved level response, but in NCEA level 3, the chances are you have shown some half decent understanding to get across the line as well. Now, the third bullet point down is an interesting one. I would certainly hope that a level 3 NCEA student in the English subject area would be writing a generally coherent response, because coherence is to do with making sense, and I would hope that your essay makes sense. Certainly, if it doesn't, that would be grounds to get a not achieved. The second part of that statement is interesting because they talk about there being an occasionally unbalanced response. And we see this in the 3.1 assessment report as well. And how I explained that in that video is essentially going back to the statement again. Now, if you remember from the previous slide, I kind of mentioned that statements often have multiple aspects. And what I would consider an unbalanced response to be would be one where you maybe spend too much time talking about one aspect to the detriment of the other. So in other words, if you had a statement which required you to talk about language features, film techniques, and the director's vision, their purpose, and you spend all your time just talking about film techniques and not really talking about how they achieve the director's purpose, then you've neglected the purpose aspect and spend all your time on the language features, film techniques aspect. So to achieve, you kind of need to be responding to both aspects in a decent way, but there may be some imbalance here. You might be spending more time on one and not as much time on the other. The fourth bullet point down is kind of the classic one that I often see in any English exam. It's just writing a plot summary. So in other words, you just kind of like told me the story of the film text that you've studied. And this can maybe help you achieve because I guess you're providing some evidence from the text, which was a hallmark of not achieved responses. They didn't have evidence. In plot description, you do have evidence, so you're kind of ticking that box, but it's certainly not complex and sophisticated, and it's not going to get you into the merit or excellence category. So, second to last bullet point is providing analysis at the end of each paragraph with just one or two sentences. Now, this is what I see when students are really relying very heavily on paragraph structures, something like Peel, for example, and they get to the end of their body paragraph and they're like, oh, link, I've got to link back to the statement. So they give me a little bit of analysis, but it's just a couple of sentences at the end of the body paragraph. Now, this also might be enough to get you across the line, but it's certainly not the kind of integrated discussion we need to see at a merit or an excellence level. So if you are a student who's really just trying to get an achieved and you're really drilled in those paragraph structures, that could be a good thing because that's going to prevent you from not achieving, right? You're going to be doing basic analysis, even if it is just at the end of the body paragraph. But if you are trying to get higher grades in that, you're going to need to integrate that analysis into the body paragraphs in a more sophisticated manner. And that's where those Peel structures can sometimes be a little bit of a double-edged sword because they can kind of lock you into just doing a little bit at the end when you've got to sprinkle it throughout the paragraph. Okay, the last one is that complicated one, in my opinion. So let me just take a bit of time with this. So it says that students employed generic phrases about concepts that needed more detail for merit. Let me just kind of break down what I think this might mean because it's a little bit unclear even to me as a teacher. But what I think it means is that students have tried to apply like more complex concepts, but they haven't fully pulled it off. I'll give you an example of what that could look like. Say you're studying a film like Barbie or something like Mad Max Fury Road. Now, you might apply a concept there like, I don't know, feminism, right? Because both of those texts have got kind of a strong gender angle. They've got strong kind of feminist themes. So you might be bringing in the concept of feminism, but the way that you're bringing it in is like really simplistic. It's quite generic. It's not super original, and you're not really explaining that to the level that we need to see for merit or excellence. So that's what I take that last bullet point to mean. You're trying to inject some more complex ideas into the discussion, but you're maybe just not fully executing, potentially because you don't really understand them enough yourself. So those are the characteristics I see from this assessment report for achieved. So what do merit candidates do? They show a clear understanding of the studied text. You know the text, you understand it well. There's no kind of question marks that are popping up in the essay about like, do you actually know this film? Have you watched this film? Because you're getting details right and you're able to back up your discussion with evidence that shows you've engaged with the text and possibly even watched it multiple times. So there's some decent, clear understanding there. The second thing down is that you're understanding the aspects in the chosen statement. So to fall back on the example I've used throughout this video, if you've got a statement where the aspects are things like language features, in other words, film techniques, and something like the director's vision or purpose, you've understood that you need to discuss language features, film techniques, and you've understood that you've got to relate those to the director's vision or purpose. And you've done this, and you've done it in a consistent way and a balanced way, okay? So you've essentially responded to the statement in a balanced way. The third bullet point down is you have strong evidence to support your answer. What does strong evidence mean? Because that's quite vague. Strong is a little bit unclear. Well, to me, strong evidence would be well-selected evidence, evidence that relates to the thing that you're actually trying to argue within a body paragraph. And also strong evidence might mean that you're touching on film techniques and using things like dialogue, quotes from characters when you can. And there's a decent level of examples popping up in your discussion too. That would be strong evidence. It would be well selected and it would be detailed and it would possibly include pretty consistent reference to some film techniques as well. Now, the fourth one down, which I've highlighted, is really important in my opinion for merit. So students explained how specific elements assisted the director/creator in conveying their ideas. What does this mean most simply? I think it means that you've discussed film techniques and you've explained how the director has used those to get their message across. Okay, that's how I take that. Film techniques, the effect they've had, how that relates to what the director is trying to say, in other words, the author's purpose, and some of the deeper messages or ideas in the text. So, yeah, that's the really important one for me at Merit. It kind of comes down to author's purpose, which it often does. The second to last bullet point there is that you've got some links beyond the text, but these are often straightforward. So, in other words, you've attempted to go beyond the text to connect the text to things like the human condition or the context in which the text was created or the modern day context, the society that we currently live in. You've tried to make some links outward to those things, but they might be a little bit simplistic, a little bit straightforward. Good job on trying to do it. You just haven't really convinced us that you've got some super insightful stuff to say there. And last but not least, students made students made basic use of relevant critical lenses or tropes. Okay, I think again they've saved the most complicated one for last, so let me just explain that. So, critical lenses are essentially kind of ways of looking at a text, ways that we might frame a text when we're trying to analyze it. So, for example, I'll use something like feminism again. Applying a feminist lens to a text means that we're really looking at like how a female character is portrayed here, even looking at how a male character is portrayed in comparison, and trying to maybe make some beyond the text links to broader ideas about women's place in society and what that might look like historically. So, what we are doing there is we're looking at a text through the critical lens of feminism. So, Merit students might be trying to do that, which is some pretty advanced analysis, but they might be doing it in a relatively basic or simplistic way. Alternatively, you might be using some key tropes. And here, what I think they're referring to often is genre tropes. So, if you're looking at a text at, say, a horror movie, well, we know horror movies have kind of conventions, common tropes, things we expect to see in horror movies, like the fact that somebody's going to die in the first 10 minutes and there's going to be a kind of masked murderer who the movie is going to spend most of its time trying to unmask. And then at the end, the final girl is going to somehow survive against the odds and make it out alive. Those are common tropes of the horror genre, so you might be employing some of those in a discussion, particularly around genre texts. Now, if you're doing that, but it's kind of a little bit basic, maybe the understanding is not fully developed, that might be grounds to get you to a merit, because as I've said, this is some pretty good analysis, but it's something you would need to work on incorporating in a more sophisticated way to get to excellence. So that's merit. Excellence, the one you've all been waiting for. What does an excellence student do? Well, the first thing they do, shock, horror, surprise, surprise, is they set up, they create, they develop, and they sustain an insightful argument. Keyword there being argument, all right? I am constantly harping on about this. You need to be thinking about the essays that you are writing as arguments, which means you need to take the statement, you need to turn it into a really strong argument or thesis statement. And you need to progress that to the point that by the end of the essay, the marker believes what you are saying. You're not just passively showing off information, you are actively convincing the marker to believe something because you've set up an argument and you've argued for that insightfully. If you do that, that is probably the number one thing that is going to get you towards an excellence, a really insightful argument that you've set up based on the statement. The second thing is there's consistent engagement with the text and the chosen statement. In other words, we can tell that you care about the text. You have something meaningful to say about it. You have engaged with it. Okay, this is a really interesting discussion, and I can tell there's maybe even a little bit of passion in what you are trying to say here, whether it's arguing for the positive or negative qualities of the text. You care about it, and you care about what you are saying about it. And you are also constantly going back to that chosen statement. I can't stress this enough. The keywords from the statement should be integrated throughout the essay in a consistent manner. The third bullet point down is that you've integrated technical analysis relevant to the argument. What the heck does that mean? Well, it means film techniques. It means that you've got some technical analysis. You're referring to film techniques, and you're referring to film techniques that are relevant to the argument that you are making. You're not just randomly talking about a wide shot that's used at a specific place in the movie that has nothing to do with what you're actually trying to say. You are talking about multiple techniques that are used, often in coordination with one another, to achieve a certain effect. They're really well chosen techniques that you are discussing. And just a tip from me is that at level 3 for excellence, I would be expecting to see certain more advanced techniques. Okay, I'm not trying to say that like camera shots and angles aren't good, or talking about like, I don't know, non-diegetic and diegetic sound is not good. That stuff is great. But that is also the stuff that you probably learned in year 10. And since then, you've probably learned about more advanced techniques in mise-en-scène analysis. You probably understand kind of editing structures and how narrative devices like flashback might be used to tell a nonlinear story. I'd be expecting to see more advanced technical analysis to get excellence at level 3 than I would be seeing at, say, level 2, level 1, where you might just be talking about camera shots and angles and diegetic and non-diegetic sound. So pump up your technical analysis to get higher grades in level 3. Fourth one down is beyond the text. You've linked the text to human concerns in ways that were on topic and engaging. So you've gone beyond the text and you've kept it focused. You haven't tried to force that beyond the text link. You've actually done it in a kind of meaningful way that we're like, yeah, that's a valid thing that you're saying about the human condition or the context that the text was created in or the modern day society, whatever it is that you are linking to, it makes sense to us. Fifth one down is you've adapted textual knowledge skillfully to respond appropriately to the statement. Wow, that was a mouthful. I stumbled over that. I'm actually going to kind of couple this with the next one, which is used evidence selectively to enhance your argument, because I feel like these two things are very, very similar. What I feel like they're getting at here is that you've used your knowledge of the text and the examples and techniques and evidence that you have stored in your mind appropriately in response to the statement and to enhance your argument. Let me try and put that even more simply. I think it means that all the evidence that you're using is supporting your argument. It's not just showing off the knowledge you've got. It's well chosen, it's well selected. And this is kind of needed in merit, in my opinion, but we see it really clearly in excellence. Everything is focused towards advancing your argument. There's no fat in this response. Now, last but not least, is a really interesting one that I feel like they've included. I can kind of sense the annoyance of the markers here because they say that excellent students did not overproduce by avoiding irrelevance and repetition. In other words, you haven't just written this massively long essay where you're constantly repeating yourself, hoping that something that you say is going to stick and get you a high mark. I sometimes call this the shotgun approach, okay? And I'm sorry to use like a violent kind of term here, but it will kind of make sense when I explain it to you. A shotgun is designed to shoot pellets in a really wide direction with the hope that it's going to hit the intended target. So the shotgun approach in essay writing is where students just blast a whole lot of words at the page at length in the hope that something is going to hit the target, something is going to get them the marks that they want. You can't really take the shotgun approach and expect to get an excellence. What you probably need to take is more of like a sniper approach. Okay, all my people who play Call of Duty and those kinds of video games out there will probably know what I'm talking about. There needs to be some precision in what you are doing here. In other words, you have an intended target, you have an argument that you are trying to make, and you are firing shots deliberately to achieve the aim of hitting that target and that target only. You are not worried about everything else. You're really laser focused. You have the target in your sights and you're just firing very, very deliberate shots. You're writing focused paragraphs, focused sentences, all of which are expanding your argument, not just kind of waffling and rambling on, kind of like I'm doing right now. So those are the qualities that I would expect to see in an excellence response. Okay, just a couple of things to close in terms of the assessment itself. You can pause this and read the whole thing, but I'll talk you through two things that I think are relevant. So, the first thing is they bring up this idea of aspects again, and they're kind of just reminding us that each of the statements is designed to incorporate aspects. Reminder of what those aspects are again, they're ideas, language features, purpose and audiences, and structure. So keep those things in your mind when you're looking at the statements because chances are you may have prepared around certain aspects more than others, i.e., you may have really focused around certain ideas, like certain themes in the text, and you might have also prepared really carefully around certain language features or film techniques, stuff like symbolism, mise-en-scène analysis stuff. And so, if you've really carefully prepared around certain aspects, then you want to be looking for the statement that includes those aspects. Otherwise, it's going to be a struggle for you. So, that's something that they kind of point out in the notes on the assessment. The last thing that they point out is that evidence is expected to be presented in the form of relevant detail, which may include quotations and other forms of detailed observation. Now, what I personally want to say here is that you are discussing a visual text. So, what do quotations look like in a visual text? Well, they look like dialogue. So, where possible, I think that you should try and incorporate some dialogue. Although, what I would say as a film studies graduate is that dialogue is only one part of filmmaking. So I would be expecting to see other forms of detailed observation, i.e., other film techniques. If all you have got is dialogue, then you're not really discussing a range of film techniques because arguably dialogue is just one film technique and there are like hundreds of other things that you could potentially be discussing. Maybe not hundreds, but you know what I mean. There are loads of other things you could be talking about besides dialogue. Having said this, I would try to include dialogue if you can, because I think there are still some pretty old school markers out there that like to see it. The only issue would be if you're discussing a film which has very little dialogue. Maybe a film like, say, Dunkirk, particularly if you're looking at a certain sequence in that film, like the opening sequence, there is virtually no dialogue. So, what you would do in that situation is make reference to the fact that there is almost no dialogue. Because what you're doing there is you're referring to dialogue as a technique, but you're pointing out how the director, Christopher Nolan, has used the absence of dialogue deliberately to achieve an intended effect. So sometimes when a technique is not being used, it might be relevant to mention that because that could be really significant too. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think that's some maybe helpful information for you too. Couple more things from the commentary section now. So basically, it points out that candidates who carefully considered specific words and phrases in the statements were led toward the convincing and perceptive responses needed for merit and excellence. As always, a careful reading of the statements is essential if candidates are to succeed well. Okay, in other words, the statement, people, the frickin' statement. I cannot stress it enough. All the times you're watching my videos and being like, this guy just is constantly going on about the statement, like he really needs to get over it. It's right there, people, in the assessment report. It is the markers of your exams telling you that the statement is critical to your success. It's not just me, it's them as well. We're all on the same page here. The statement. Okay, the next thing is that the ability that you have to read and understand the statement and form an argument in response to it is key. So they're reinforcing this now. And they're saying that if students can do this and provide evidence, even if it's thin and plot based, then you're going to achieve the standard. So, in other words, if you set up a simple argument based on the statement, you can have pretty thin evidence, maybe even fall into some of that plot summary, but it's still going to get you across the line. This really shows to me that the bar is pretty low for achieving in this standard. You don't have to do a heck of a lot. You just have to make sure you don't ignore that statement. You've got to keep it in mind, set up an argument, and respond to it. And to reiterate, my shotgun approach thing, they state that many essays were over 2,000 words but contained much irrelevance and or repetition, so they were hard to reward. In other words, they were hard to give high marks to. If you are writing thousands and thousands of words, you are taking the shotgun approach, and chances are you're probably not actually hitting the target that you think you are. You need to be focused. You need to write a concise essay. something around 900, 1,000 words is enough if the content is really good. 2,000 words might just be a whole bunch of rambling waffle. Again, kind of like what I'm doing right now. So let's move on. Successful text. This is often the most interesting section of the assessment report. It's also the section that my students like to read, and they go like, "Sir, are you trying to tell me that like people in other schools are studying Barbie and you've made us do this like horrible film from the 1970s or whatever?" And I'm like, "Yes, because I know better than you." But the successful text section is really interesting. It points out which texts are popular. So we can see that things like Barbie or Mad Max Fury Road, Get Out, Parasite are popular. But what I've highlighted there is something I think is really important when we're talking about texts. Bearing in mind that lots of students across New Zealand might be studying these texts, meaning there are literally thousands of essays that are being produced on sometimes the same texts, you really need a point of difference. And they point out that obvious thematic ideas sometimes appear to limit candidates' ability to respond in an original or statement specific way. In other words, if you've studied a film and you've kind of learned ideas, or you've gone onto SparkNotes or even ChatGPT and just got the most basic and generic ideas about that text, and you've been like, okay, I'm going to write an essay about this, chances are, so has everybody else. Chances are you'll be writing an essay that looks like everybody else's essay and it won't be very good. You really need to come up with your own original insights. They are likely to be unique and different from what the person sitting 3 rows over who's writing about the same text is saying, and that's probably going to lead to your essay being more interesting than theirs and ideally getting better marks. Just wanted to mention that. The second thing I've highlighted is this comment here. Some candidates wrote on texts that made the appropriate level of complexity hard to reach. In other words, they chose texts that were too simplistic, and it means they couldn't say anything deep and meaningful. The examples that they give are the Lego Movie and Spider-Man, although I would argue that the Lego Movie has actually got some pretty heavy themes about like children growing up into adults who've kind of forgotten who they are, and Spider-Man has some pretty hectic stuff about grief as well. But anyway, I digress. The point they're trying to make is essentially don't think you know better than your teacher and pick some text that you really enjoyed because you saw it in Netflix on the weekend and you want to write about it, because chances are it might not be appropriate. Take a lesson from me personally. I am telling you about an experience I had at school where I did exactly this. I thought I knew better than my teacher. I chose a film text that I thought was cool, that I thought was interesting, and I surprised her by writing about it in the exam. And guess what? I did horribly. I should have listened to my teacher, and I only realize that now I'm like way older and I am a teacher, and I kind of can empathize with how she must have felt when I kind of totally did the wrong thing entirely. So if you are that student who's like, I have not engaged with the film that we've done in class, I want to do my own thing, please talk to your teacher about that and make sure that you do settle on a text which is appropriate, which has the level of complexity that's going to allow you to achieve at NCEA level 3. Talk to them. It will save you a lot of grief in the long run. And hopefully this video has saved you a lot of grief in the long run, because now you understand how this exam works. If you're looking for other videos that talk about other exams like the 3.1 written text exam or the unfamiliar text exam, for example, I have a whole lot of videos about these on my channel. If you like what I'm doing, you can like my videos and subscribe to my channel as well. Drop me a comment on anything you want to see in future. I'm happy to entertain those as well. I am the Lit Teacher. You can probably see some other videos up here or subscribe to my channel down here somewhere. And until next time, ka kite and best of luck with your exams.